The autumn rain had been falling steadily over Portland, Oregon since morning, turning the streets into mirrors that reflected the warm glow of shop windows and streetlights. Inside Rosie's Diner on Northeast Broadway, the atmosphere was cozy and familiar. The smell of coffee, grilled burgers, and apple pie filled the air, while Patsy Cline played softly from the vintage jukebox in the corner. The red vinyl booths were mostly occupied by the usual Tuesday evening crowd: construction workers finishing late shifts, college students studying over endless cups of coffee, and a handful of elderly regulars who'd been coming here for decades. Emma Richardson sat alone in a booth near the window, her weathered hands wrapped around a cup of chamomile tea that had long since gone cold. At 73, she was a small woman, barely 5'2", with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and kind blue eyes that crinkled at the corners from a lifetime of smiling. She wore a simple floral dress under a beige cardigan, clothes that had been carefully maintained for years because her widow's pension didn't stretch far. The remains of her dinner, a bowl of chicken soup and half a grilled cheese sandwich, sat on the table before her. She'd been coming to Rosie's every Tuesday for the past 8 months, ever since her husband Robert had passed away from lung cancer. It was the one meal a week she allowed herself to eat out, a small comfort that made the empty house feel a little less lonely. Emma opened her worn leather purse and began carefully counting out bills and coins for her check. Her hands moved slowly, arthritis making each movement deliberate and slightly painful. She'd arranged the money in neat piles on the table: $14 for the meal, $2 for the tip. She always tipped exactly 15%, calculated carefully because she remembered what it was like to work service jobs when she was young. At the counter, waitress Lauren Mitchell watched Emma with affection. At 26, Lauren had been working at Rosie's for 3 years, and Emma had become one of her favorite customers, always polite, always patient, always remembering to ask about Lauren's college classes. "No rush, Mrs. Richardson," Lauren called out warmly. "Take your time." Emma smiled gratefully and continued organizing her money, unaware of the growing impatience from the man standing in line behind her booth. Christopher Wade was a big man, 6'3", and pushing 240 pounds, most of it muscle-earned through obsessive gym routines and supplement regimens he bragged about to anyone who'd listen. At 34, he worked construction, but fancied himself an alpha male, someone who dominated every space he entered. His thick neck was decorated with tribal tattoos, and he wore a tight black t-shirt that showed off his arms, designer jeans, and expensive boots. He'd been waiting to pay for his to-go order for maybe 90 seconds, but his patience, never his strong suit, had already evaporated. "Jesus Christ," he muttered loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Some of us have places to be." Emma didn't hear him, focused on recounting her money to make sure she had the right amount. Her hearing aids were old, sometimes unreliable, and the diner's ambient noise made it difficult to distinguish individual voices. Christopher's jaw clenched. He'd had a bad day. His supervisor had chewed him out for sloppy work. His girlfriend had broken up with him via text, and his truck payment was overdue. He was looking for an outlet, and this old woman counting change like it was the Great Depression was an easy target. "Hey!" he barked, stepping closer. "You done sometime this century, Grandma?" Emma looked up, startled, her blue eyes wide. "Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm almost finished. Just need to—" "Well, hurry the fuck up," Christopher snapped. "Some of us actually have lives." The diner went quiet. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Patsy Cline's voice suddenly seemed too loud. Lauren started moving from behind the counter, but the restaurant's owner, Joe Rossi, put a hand on her arm. He'd dealt with aggressive customers before and knew when to intervene and when to wait. In the back corner booth, partially hidden by shadow and the coat rack near the entrance, a man in his mid-30s lowered the paperback novel he'd been reading. David Richardson had been sitting there for the past 45 minutes, nursing a cup of black coffee and waiting. He'd told his mother he was coming to Portland for a few days. Military leave, he'd said vaguely, but hadn't mentioned he'd arrived a day early. He wanted to surprise her, maybe take her to breakfast tomorrow morning. He hadn't expected to find her here, and he certainly hadn't expected this. David didn't move yet. He watched his mother's face, saw the confusion and fear there, and felt something cold and sharp settle in his chest. He'd been a Navy SEAL for 12 years, done 4 tours in the Middle East, operated in situations most people couldn't imagine. But none of that training prepared him for watching his mother be intimidated in a place that should have been safe. "I'm sorry," Emma repeated, her voice trembling slightly as she tried to gather her money faster. But her arthritic fingers fumbled, and several quarters rolled off the table, bouncing across the floor with metallic clinks that seemed impossibly loud in the silent diner. "Oh, for fuck's sake," Christopher growled. Emma bent down to retrieve the fallen coins, but her movements were slow, hindered by age and the sudden stress flooding her system. She managed to pick up 1 quarter, then another, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow. Robert had always helped with things like this in his final years. His hands had been steadier than hers. Christopher's patience, already non-existent, shattered completely. "Move," he said, pushing past her booth with unnecessary force. His hip knocked into the table, causing Emma's purse to tumble to the floor, spilling its contents across the worn linoleum. "Oh no," Emma whispered, staring at the scattered items, her wallet, her pill organizer, a photo of Robert from their wedding day, lipstick, tissues, a small Bible with a cracked leather cover. "Maybe if you weren't so fucking slow," Christopher said, stepping over her belongings without a second glance as he headed toward the register. Something inside Emma broke. Not her spirit, that had been tested and proven resilient through 7 decades of life, but rather her capacity to remain silent in the face of cruelty. "Young man," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "there's no need for such language. I'm moving as fast as I can." Christopher turned around slowly, and the look on his face made several other diners shrink back in their seats. "What did you say to me?" "I said," Emma began, but her voice wavered. "Let me tell you something, lady," Christopher said, walking back toward her booth. He loomed over her, using his size to intimidate. "I don't give a shit how old you are. You're holding up the line, you're wasting everyone's time, and now you're giving me attitude. You want to know what I think? I think old people like you should stay home if you can't handle basic fucking tasks like paying a bill." Emma's face went pale. Her hands, still clutching a few coins, began to tremble visibly. Lauren had heard enough. She came around the counter quickly. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave, now." "I'm leaving as soon as I get my food," Christopher shot back. "But first, Granny here needs to understand that the world doesn't revolve around her and her goddamn pennies." He reached down and swept the remaining coins off Emma's table with a brutal swipe of his hand. They scattered everywhere, rolling under booths and across the floor. One hit Emma in the chest before falling into her lap. The gesture was so casually cruel, so deliberately humiliating, that several people gasped. Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she refused to let them fall. She'd lived through too much. The death of her parents, raising 2 children on modest means, nursing her husband through 18 months of cancer, to break down in front of this bully. But the fear was real. This man was so much bigger, so much stronger, and his anger was palpable. She'd read about incidents like this in the newspaper, road rage, parking lot arguments that turned violent. She was alone, vulnerable, and everyone else in the diner seemed too frightened to help. "Pick them up," Christopher demanded, pointing at the scattered coins. "Excuse me." Emma's voice was barely a whisper. "You heard me. Get down on your hands and knees and pick up your fucking change. Maybe it'll teach you to move faster next time." Joe Rossi, was already reaching for the phone to call the police, and Lauren had positioned herself between Christopher and Emma, but both knew that by the time help arrived, more damage could be done. That's when David Richardson stood up. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He simply rose from his booth in the corner with the kind of smooth, economical movement that spoke of absolute physical confidence. He was about 6 feet tall, lean but clearly strong, with short-cropped brown hair and the kind of calm, assessing eyes that missed nothing. He wore faded jeans, a plain grey t-shirt, and a worn leather jacket, nothing that announced his profession or capabilities. He moved through the diner with perfect silence, his footsteps making no sound on the floor. Years of tactical training had taught him how to move without drawing attention until he wanted to be noticed. Christopher didn't see him coming. He was too focused on Emma, too wrapped up in his own anger and the rush of power he felt from dominating someone weaker. David stopped about 3 feet behind him. "Step away from my mother," he said quietly. The words were soft, conversational even, but they carried a weight that made everyone in the diner sit up straighter. There was no aggression in David's tone, no threat, just a simple statement of fact, delivered with absolute certainty. Christopher turned around, a sneer already forming on his face. He was used to intimidating people with his size, and he expected this interference to fold like all the others. "Your mother? Well, maybe you should teach the old bitch some manners and—" He didn't finish the sentence. David had moved closer, not threateningly, just closer, and Christopher's words died as he actually looked at the man in front of him. There was something in those calm brown eyes, something in the way this guy held himself that triggered every primitive instinct Christopher had. This wasn't some random do-gooder trying to play hero. This was someone who knew exactly what they were capable of. "I'm going to give you one chance," David said, his voice still quiet, still calm. "Apologize to my mother, pay for your food, and leave. We'll forget this happened." Christopher's ego warred with his survival instincts. He was bigger, probably outweighed this guy by 40 pounds, but something told him that wouldn't matter. "Who the fuck do you think you—" David moved. Not to strike, not to threaten, but simply to position himself between Christopher and Emma. The movement was so smooth, so professional, that it spoke volumes about training and experience. He leaned in close, speaking directly into Christopher's ear at a volume no one else could hear. "I'm going to explain something to you once," David said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I've spent 12 years in the Navy, SEAL Team 3. I've operated in places where men like you wouldn't last 5 minutes. I've dealt with insurgents, terrorists, and people who would make you look like a kindergarten bully. I'm giving you this warning because I don't want to hurt you. I don't want to cause a scene in this restaurant that my mother loves. I don't want to end your night in a hospital or a jail cell, but if you take one more step toward her, if you say one more word to her, if you do anything except apologize and leave, I will make you regret it in ways you can't currently imagine. Do we understand each other?" He delivered the words without emotion, without anger, as if he were reading a weather report. That clinical detachment was more terrifying than any amount of rage could have been. Christopher's face went through a series of rapid changes, confusion, disbelief, fear, and finally, as recognition dawned, something approaching terror. SEAL Team 3. He'd watched enough movies, read enough articles to know what that meant. These weren't regular military. These were the guys who did things that never made it into official reports. David stepped back, giving Christopher space. "Your choice," he said, still in that same quiet tone. The entire confrontation had taken maybe 30 seconds, but it felt like hours. Every person in the diner was frozen, watching. Christopher's hands, which had been clenched into fists, slowly opened. His aggressive posture melted into something more defensive. He looked at Emma, who was watching her son, with a mixture of shock and relief, and something like shame flickered across his face. I... Christopher started, then stopped. The words stuck in his throat. "My mother is waiting," David said. Christopher cleared his throat. When he spoke, his voice had lost all its earlier aggression. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he mumbled, not quite meeting Emma's eyes. "I was out of line. I apologize." Emma nodded slowly, too stunned to speak. David turned to Lauren, who'd been watching the exchange with wide eyes. "Lauren, how much is his food?" $18.50, she managed to say. David pulled a 20 from his wallet and handed it to Christopher. "Pay for your food and leave. The change is yours." Christopher took the money like it might burn him. He walked to the counter, paid, grabbed his to-go bag, and left without another word. Through the window, everyone watched him practically sprint to his truck and drive away with uncharacteristic caution. Only after the truck's tail lights had disappeared did David turn back to his mother. He knelt down beside her booth, his expression transforming from controlled intensity to gentle concern. "Hi, Mom," he said softly. "David?" Emma's voice was shaky. "What are you doing here? You said you weren't coming until tomorrow." "Wanted to surprise you," he said with a slight smile. He began gathering the scattered coins and items from her purse. "Guess the surprise is on me." Emma reached out and touched his face, as if confirming he was real. "You're here," she whispered. Then, as reality crashed back in, tears finally began to fall. "That man. He was so angry, and I couldn't—" "Shh, it's okay. He's gone. You're safe." David collected the last of her belongings and handed her the purse. Then he slid into the booth across from her and took her hands in his. They were trembling still, but her grip on his hands was fierce. The diner slowly came back to life. Conversations resumed, though many were now about what they'd just witnessed. Joe Rossi approached the table carefully, wiping his hands on his apron. "Dave, I thought that was you in the corner," Joe said. He'd known the Richardson family for 25 years, had watched David grow from a kid ordering chocolate milkshakes to a man who'd served his country with distinction. "Thank you for handling that. I was about to call the cops, but, well, you resolved it better than they probably could have." "Thanks, Joe. Sorry for the disruption." "Disruption? Are you kidding? That asshole was ruining everyone's night." Joe looked at Emma with concern. "Mrs. Richardson, your dinner's on the house tonight, both of yours, and I'm making you both a slice of apple pie, still warm from this afternoon's batch." "That's very kind, Joe, but you don't have to—" Emma began. "I insist. Lauren, get these two whatever they want." Joe paused, then added quietly to David, "Your dad would be proud of you. The way you handled that, controlled, protective, but no unnecessary violence. That's a man who knows his strength and doesn't need to prove it." After Joe left, Emma and David sat in silence for a moment. Finally, Emma spoke. "You frightened that man." "Yes." "Without touching him." "Yes." "How?" David considered his answer carefully. "Mom, guys like that, bullies, they're used to intimidating people who can't fight back. It makes them feel powerful, but deep down, they're cowards. They pick on elderly ladies, kids, anyone vulnerable. When they encounter someone who actually knows how to handle themselves, their entire worldview cracks." I just helped him understand the reality of the situation. "What did you say to him?" Emma asked. "When you whispered in his ear?" David smiled slightly. "I explained the consequences of his choices in terms he could understand. You didn't threaten him. I gave him information and let him make an informed decision." David squeezed her hands gently. "Mom, I need to ask you something. Has this happened before? People treating you badly like this?" Emma looked down at their joined hands. "Sometimes. Not usually this bad, but yes. People get impatient with old folks. We move too slow, we take too long, we're in the way. Most of the time I just ignore it." "You shouldn't have to ignore it," David said firmly. "You're not in the way. You're not a burden. You're a human being who deserves respect and dignity." Lauren arrived with 2 generous slices of apple pie, each topped with vanilla ice cream. "Here you go, Mrs. Richardson, and you must be her son. She talks about you all the time. Thank you for what you did. That guy's been coming in here for a few weeks, and he's always rude. But tonight—" She shook her head. "I'm glad you were here." After Lauren left, Emma picked up her fork, but didn't eat immediately. "David, I need you to understand something. I'm proud of you, so proud of what you've done with your life, how you've served our country, but I'm also terrified every single day that something will happen to you, that you'll be hurt or—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "I know, Mom. So when I see you handle a situation like that, so calm, so controlled, part of me is grateful, and part of me is reminded of all the danger you face that I'll never know about." A tear rolled down her cheek. "Your father and I always worried about you." David moved to sit beside her in the booth, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Dad told me something before he died," he said quietly. "Do you remember, at the end, when he asked to talk to me alone?" Emma nodded. Robert had been lucid for a few brief hours, had insisted on speaking to their son privately. He said, "David, I'm proud of the man you've become, but your most important mission isn't overseas. It's taking care of your mother when I'm gone." I promised him I would. David looked at her seriously. "I'm sorry I haven't been here as much as I should. I'm sorry you've had to deal with situations like tonight alone. That changes now. I'm requesting a stateside assignment. I'll be based out of Coronado, which means I can visit every few weeks, more if you need me." "Oh, David, you don't have to change your career for me." "I'm not changing it. I'm evolving it. I've been operational for 12 years. It's time for me to transition to training roles, maybe instruction. The Navy needs experienced guys teaching the next generation." He smiled. "Besides, I'm not getting any younger. These knees aren't what they used to be." Emma laughed through her tears and took a bite of pie. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the warmth of the diner and the sweetness of the dessert helping to wash away the earlier tension. The following morning, David took his mother to breakfast at a small cafe near her house in northeast Portland. The rain had stopped, leaving everything fresh and clean-smelling. They walked slowly, Emma's arm linked through David's, her pace setting theirs. Over omelettes and coffee, they talked about everything: family news, his possible new assignment, her volunteering at the local library, the book club she'd joined. Normal conversation, the kind they'd missed during his long deployments. "I've been thinking about last night," Emma said eventually, "about what that man, Christopher, was trying to do." "What do you mean?" "He was trying to make me feel small, powerless. He wanted to dominate the situation, to feel important by making me feel insignificant." She stirred her coffee thoughtfully. "But here's what he didn't understand. I've buried my parents, raised 2 children on a teacher's salary, nursed your father through cancer, and lived through 7 decades of life's challenges. I've known real hardship, real loss, real fear. Some angry man in a diner throwing coins at me, that's nothing compared to holding your husband's hand as he takes his last breath." David listened, seeing his mother with fresh eyes, not as someone fragile who needed protection, but as someone strong who'd survived everything life threw at her. "What you did last night," Emma continued, "wasn't just about protecting me physically. You gave me back my dignity. You showed that bully that his behavior had consequences, that he couldn't just mistreat people without someone standing up." She reached across the table and took his hand. "But here's what I want you to remember, sweetheart. You didn't win that confrontation through violence or intimidation. You won through control, through measured response, through strength that didn't need to be proven with fists." "That's what they teach us," David said. "Real operators don't need to broadcast their capabilities. The guy who's loudest in the bar is usually the one who'll fold first in a real situation." True professionals are quiet because they know what they can do and don't need validation from others. Exactly. And that's the lesson I hope other people learned last night. Not just Christopher, but everyone watching. Emma squeezed his hand. Strength isn't about size or aggression. It's about character, control, and knowing when to act and when to walk away. You could have hurt that man badly, but you chose not to. That's real power. They finished breakfast and walked back to Emma's house, a small but well-maintained bungalow with a garden full of roses that were preparing for winter dormancy. David spent the afternoon fixing things around the house, a leaky faucet, a loose railing, changing the batteries in her smoke detectors, simple tasks that Robert used to do, tasks that Emma had been managing alone for 8 months. As the sun began to set, David prepared to head back to his hotel. Emma walked him to the door, and they stood on the porch together, watching the neighborhood come alive with evening activity. Kids riding bikes home before dark, neighbors returning from work, the first lights beginning to glow in windows. "David," Emma said, "I want you to know something. What happened last night was frightening, yes, but it also reminded me that I'm not alone. Even when you're thousands of miles away, even when we go weeks without seeing each other, I know you're there. That matters more than you probably realize. You're never alone, Mom. I'm a phone call away always." "I know, but it's more than that. You represent something important, the idea that good people still stand up to bullies, that kindness and respect still matter, that dignity is worth defending." She smiled up at him. "Last night, everyone in that diner saw that young people like you haven't forgotten how to honor their elders, how to protect the vulnerable. In a world that can feel very harsh sometimes, that gives me hope." David hugged her tightly. "I love you, Mom. I'll be back next weekend." "I love you too, sweetheart. Be safe." As David drove away, Emma stood on her porch for a long moment, watching the taillights disappear around the corner. She thought about Christopher Wade and wondered if he'd learned anything from the encounter. She hoped he had, hoped he'd realized that treating people with cruelty had consequences, that the elderly woman counting coins might have a son who'd fought in wars, that the quiet person in the corner might be the most dangerous one in the room. But more than that, she hoped he'd learned that true strength wasn't about muscles or aggression. It was about control, character, and the courage to do the right thing even when it would be easier to look away. Inside, Emma made herself a cup of tea and settled into Robert's old recliner, the one she'd kept, even though it took up too much space in the small living room. She picked up the photo from her purse, the one that had spilled onto the diner floor. Robert, in his army uniform on their wedding day, young and handsome and full of dreams. "He's a good man, Robert," she whispered to the photograph. "We raised a good man. You'd be so proud of him." And somewhere in the Portland night, David Richardson drove through rain-slicked streets, thinking about strength and protection, about promises made to dying fathers and the responsibility of power. He'd spent 12 years learning how to be dangerous, how to operate in the world's most hostile environments, how to eliminate threats with precision and efficiency. But tonight, he'd learned something equally important, that the greatest victories aren't won with violence, that true strength is measured in restraint, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not on distant battlefields, but in ordinary places like diners, standing up for ordinary people who deserve extraordinary respect. The rain began again, gentle and cleansing, washing the city clean. And in that moment, everything felt right. The balance between strength and mercy, between capability and control, between the warrior trained to fight and the son devoted to protecting what truly mattered. Some lessons, David reflected, couldn't be taught in training. They had to be lived in quiet moments and small actions, in choosing dignity over dominance and love over fear. That was the real measure of a man.